Thank you all for coming to the talk. I hope it's informative, helpful. The talk is called Building the Front Half of Your App with Grunt. I think the with Grunt part kind of didn't make its way into the title. So, but I will be talking about Grunt, which is the build tool that I've written in JavaScript. First of all, before I start, has anyone who's used Grunt before? Okay, so some people, other people haven't, but maybe are like, who's curious about Grunt, right? Okay, some people are curious about Grunt, excellent. So one of the things I want to do in this talk is I want to get you a little more acquainted with what Grunt is, why you care, and just kind of give you like a little kind of intro to how you might use it, show it off in a few projects, etc. I usually do tons of live coding, but I've done more slides in this presentation, so I have no idea how the time is going to work out, but I'm going to try. If I finish early, there's plenty of time for question and answers, etc. So anyways, I'm Ben Allman. You can find me on Twitter, on GitHub as Cowboy. And if you're at a Cowboys game, you can mistweet at me. I get that all the time. I work at Boku. We're the Rooster. We're a web development company up in Boston, and we do a lot of cool stuff with open source. And without that ability, I would not have had the time to write or maintain Grunt. So anyways, I want to start off with just some real basic stuff, like what is Grunt, right? It's a task runner. There are a lot of names for these kind of things, like a build tool, an automation system. I just call it a task runner. You predefine tasks, and then you can run them. And there's, you can get really complicated. A task can be something in a plugin, or it can just be a JavaScript function that you run, and it can have any arbitrary code in it. Okay. And so it is written in JavaScript. It is a task runner in JavaScript. There are other systems for automation. Make, Ant, Maven, Gradle, tons of things, just in kind of the Java sphere. And then of course there's like, there's Rake for Ruby. There's tons of like they're all based on what Make did 40 years ago. So I've definitely I'm not creating anything new here. But this is at the time when I needed to automate 50 projects, I was writing tons of jQuery plugins, and they were all like the same, but they were all slightly different. At the time I was doing that, I was looking into alternatives, and there was nothing that allowed me to write JavaScript, which is my primary language, and do what I wanted to do. Mainly, having nice output, nice visual output. I'm really OCD about that stuff. So I wrote Grunt. Why do you care? Why do you want to use it, right? It allows you to do this automation stuff in your projects. It allows you to not have to have bash scripts. It allows you to not necessarily use a makefile or be tied down to a particular operating system or installing tons of command line dependencies, et cetera, in your project, because you're writing it in JavaScript and it's leveraging the infrastructure built around Node.js and NPM, which I'll talk a little bit more about later, to help you do all of this stuff. So some benefits is there's a very large community of developers working on Grunt plugins. When I initially created it, Grunt actually just had a few plugins built in. I happened to say, hey, if you want to add your own plugins, you can do this, and people did that. But I didn't really think anyone would do that. I just built it kind of accidentally. And so now there's a ton of them. When you're doing your web development front-end kind of tasks, and I'll get into this more, some of the best ones that you're going to use aren't written in Ruby or Java or Erlang or Scala or Bash or our compiled C programs. Some of them are, but most of the best ones, the ones that are getting the newest features fastest, are being written by people who are web developers, who are also engineers, who are writing software for automating their processes. And they're writing those tools in JavaScript. And they're distributing them through NPM, like Grunt. Node.js, and NPM is the package manager for Node. Comes with Node when you install it. It works pretty much anywhere. And I have slides for each one of these things. Continuous integration. If you want to actually use Grunt as a continuous integration tool with a service of your choice, it works that way. And it actually is getting IDE support. I mean, people are building like Sublime snippets and stuff like that for text editors, basic, but it's actually getting integrated into IDEs now, which is pretty sweet. I'll show you guys some of that. So about the community and the amount of plugins out there. There are, I took the screenshot this morning as I was writing my slides, because who writes their slides before the morning of, 2,711 plugins for Grunt. Now, there aren't 2,711 good plugins, obviously. We actually maintain, the Grunt project, we maintain a set of contrib plugins. We saw some other projects that were doing something similar to that, and we wanted to kind of give people an example of some of the most commonly used plugins, and give them like kind of write them in an idiomatic way so that when people use these plugins, they would feel like they're using Grunt. And so we wrote a standard set of plugins that started with some really basic stuff like let's concatenate some files and create an output file. Or let's do some super basic unit testing or whatever. We wrote some basic plugins that way, but the series actually grew to include, it's about 36 plugins now. Those ones we vouch for, and in the plugins listing, they all have stars next to them. This is just if you want to lint some code, there happens to be 42 different plugins for linting tons of different things. Most of them are focused around JavaScript, but some of them are for CSS. Some of them are for CoffeeScript and other things that might compile into JavaScript. If I look for contrib here, we've got, well, it'll say 81, but some of these aren't actually officially supported. People just name their thing contrib because they don't realize what we're trying to do. But there's a lot of plugins that handle a lot of the really fundamental things that you would want to do with any system that you could do in Make by just saying copy or remove or move or something like that, CP, RM, MV. Well, we have a copy plugin. We have a move, like we have rename. We have all of these different things, some basic plugins. But most of them are based around doing specific tasks that are kind of Grunt wrappers, if you will, around libraries that are available, around command line tools that are available. Like CoffeeScript. Who's familiar with CoffeeScript here? For those of you who are not familiar with CoffeeScript, it is a language, it's kind of like in between JavaScript and Ruby. It looks a lot more like Ruby. It compiles into JavaScript. They originally wrote the first CoffeeScript parser compiler in JavaScript, and they got CoffeeScript to the point where they then wrote the parser in CoffeeScript to compile itself. It was crazy. But either way, it compiles down into JavaScript. And there's a number of plugins for compiling CoffeeScript. There's other things like TypeScript, LiveScript, et cetera. There's a lot of plugins. And these are maintained by the people who are doing a lot of the web development, doing like really interesting things with the web and focusing on JavaScript. So they work with Grunt. Although there are plugins where if anyone's used Sass or Compass, like there are Grunt plugins that literally just shell out to Sass, which runs under Ruby. So as long as you have that stuff in your path, it'll just work. There are Grunt plugins that shell out to Phantom.js, which is a JavaScript run headless Qt WebKit browser. It doesn't run in Node.js. It's like a separate compiled executable. It runs JavaScript internally. Grunt can shell it to that to do headless unit testing. We'll actually see some of that later on. So there's a lot of plugins, and they're being maintained. And you can pretty easily separate the good ones from the bad ones by just poking around, checking their rebies, see how many people, see how many downloads they have, or see how many people are starring them on GitHub, et cetera. We're talking about this tooling that's written in JavaScript. We have like linting tools like JSHint, JSLint. JSHint is a maybe slightly friendlier fork of JSLint, but they're both linting tools. JSCS, which is a code style validator, like white space and curly braces, stuff like that. Esprima will parse JavaScript into an abstract syntax tree so you can transform it. And I'm just listing some of these. Stylus and Less, these are two CSS abstractions. I actually, in the slide deck, I'll show you guys. I used Stylus for my CSS, so I didn't have to write, because I like the format a little bit better. And as I'm saving the file, Grunt watches the file system to automatically compile it into CSS and then reload the entire slide deck as I was writing it 2 hours ago. CoffeeScript, TypeScript, LiveScript, there's a lot of languages that compile into JavaScript, and those are actually usually written in JavaScript. They all have their own benefits and drawbacks, but there's a lot of those written in JavaScript. There's a lot of templating languages written in JavaScript. There's JavaScript-specific templating languages. There are also ones that are language agnostic and very declarative, like Mustache. If you use that, you can use Mustache templates in anything because it's such a simple declarative syntax. It's very easy to write a compiler for that. There's a lot of unit testing frameworks. I mean, if you're writing JavaScript code and you want to test it, you're going to use a JavaScript unit testing framework. So I guess this line is kind of it's an obvious one. If you want to unit test your JavaScript, you're going to use a JavaScript unit testing framework, like one of these, and of course there's a lot more. And I'm listing things for which I know there are Grunt plugins, but there are certainly, if I just go to the Grunt plugins page and search for test or unit, like I'll get a lot. There's also things that are far more complex that deal with taking your JavaScript. Has anyone heard of source maps before? A couple hands. What source maps are is, okay, step back. Who's minified JavaScript before? Okay, a lot more people. Instead of having a big JavaScript file that you send down to the browser with every request, you remove all the comments and white space, and you make local variables. You reduce their names down to 1 character and stuff like that, so the file is smaller, so that when gzipped, it's as small as possible. So like, there's a tool, Uglify.js, that can take all of your JavaScript files and concatenate them into one thing and remove all the white space and do all that, and at the same time create this source map file, which most modern browsers actually understand. It is a mapping of where in this new minified file each token inside of there corresponds to a line number and column of the original file, which means when you're debugging it in the console and your browser understands source maps, you actually get real line numbers, even with minified code. It's super cool. Uglify supports that. Uglify, that's a pretty complicated Grunt plugin. They're doing a lot with that. Require.js. That, on the other hand, the Grunt plugin is just a very simple wrapper around the R.js command line utility, which is a tool that allows, if anyone's used Require or AMD or UMD or any of these ways of declaring modules in your JavaScript, it will trace an entire dependency graph through your entire JavaScript application. You don't need to have like 10,000 lines of global JavaScript. You can modularize it, use a tool like Require.js, and that will actually build all of your JavaScript into that one file, minify, generate source maps, do all that stuff. And then there are Webpack, Browserify, those are other tools that do a similar thing. There are a lot of great tools written in JavaScript. And I mean, I remember back when I was like before Grunt, using shell scripts, and I was using like Java jars for like doing like my JavaScript minification and stuff like that. There were no JavaScript tools. They were just starting to come into existence. I can do everything, almost everything I need to do in Node these days. Node works pretty much anywhere. If you go to their website, go to the download page, you'll see you can download binaries for the major systems. You can download source code. It exists in package managers for both Windows and Unix and OS X. You have a lot of options for installing Node. There are virtual environment managers like what RVM or RBEnv would be for Node. I use one called Nave. You have tons of options, but Node will work on like every system, and it's a pretty easy install too. In terms of continuous integration, Grunt itself uses Travis CI. So when Grunt actually grunts itself, every time I push a commit up to GitHub, Travis will take a look at that commit, it'll pull it down, it'll run a full build, and we can actually see like in Travis, I'm building Grunt against multiple versions of Node, 0.8, 0.10, and the future 0.11 version. That's kind of, that's not actually live yet, but we can actually see the output from these jobs and see the entire Grunt process. Well, there were no errors, so it It was pretty quick there. We use Travis CI. We also recently started using Windows continuous integration called AppVeyor, which does the same kind of thing, but for Windows. We looked into using Jenkins. You can use that. There's tons of CI services. Basically, you can use any CI service you want because Grunt just exits with exit codes. 0 if success, non-zero if there's an errors, and there's a guide in the documentation what the non-zero error codes mean. Plus, you'll actually see a log. You can turn the colors off. There's a whole bunch of options for what you do with the output, so you can grep it, parse it, do whatever you want. And we're looking at integrating other ways of, people have written plugins for this, but we're looking at integrating a core like custom reporters for like outputting XML if your system actually reads XML. But people have hacked things into Grunt to do that kind of stuff. Either way, it exits with standard exit codes, so you can utilize those. I don't have any, I thought about this. I thought about talking about other build tools like Ant or Maven or Gradle or Rake or any of these other systems. The thing is I really haven't used them, so I'm just like, I just spent all this time looking for examples online to see how you use Grunt with Ant, how you use Ant inside of Grunt. It doesn't really matter. You can shell out to Grunt. Grunt can shell out to something else. So you can use Grunt inside of any other build system. If you, let's just say you're using Ant, and this is what jQuery did. Who's heard of jQuery here? Like everyone, right? Okay, jQuery was one of the first big projects to use Grunt, and the reason it did probably is because I work with people who work on jQuery, and I've contributed to jQuery, and they were looking at what I was doing, and they're like, they're using Ant, and they want to reduce their dependencies, and they want to simplify the process, and they find, for whatever reason, these JavaScript developers happened to not really like coding in XML. So they were checking out Grunt, they used it, and what they did is they migrated parts over as they went by replacing certain things in Ant and shelling out to Grunt for those things. And eventually, they just replaced all of Ant with Grunt. They said it was a lot faster. I can only believe them. They have a huge build process and lots of testing and stuff, so they seem to like it. But they migrated over a little bit at a time. And if you wanted to, let's just say your system became predominantly Grunt-based, but you still had some other thing you had to shell out to. There's a spawn command built into Grunt, and it's just JavaScript running in Node. Node has a full API and tons of docs. You can do whatever you want in a Grunt task. It's just Node.js. So you can shell out and do whatever you want. You can run. There's some really cool, there's this shell.js lib that you can install that will allow you to shell out synchronously. It does some crazy stuff on the back end to make it work. Either way, you have tons of options with how you integrate Grunt into your workflow. Just try it and see, right? Ultimately, I advocate for using just one build system at a time and trying not to cobble too many things together from different systems because it can be a little fragile when you're dealing with pathing on different systems and stuff like that. But it works. It just goes in your path. You have a command you can use to run it. IDE support. I thought this was super cool. WebStorm in the latest version just added a Grunt console. I'd never used WebStorm before, but I've never been an IDE guy. I've always been like Sublime. Just give me like a box that I can just throw code into with good search and replace and stuff. But I was checking this out when I saw the RC came out, and it's actually pretty cool. And I actually wanted to show, now, right now, I'm in my directory here. I've got this is the slides, or just this HTML file. I've got a Grunt file for this project. I've got some assets. I'm building the stylus file into CSS. And just to show you what this Grunt file looks like. So there's not much to it for this project. I could have gone super crazy, but I literally sat down. I started this is what I always do. I'm like, I don't need to use Grunt. So I sit down and I'm doing all this stuff by hand, and I'm like, oh my God, why am I not just compiling? I don't want to write CSS. I want to write stylus because it's I don't know if you guys are familiar with CSS, but stylus lets you remove all the colons and the curly braces, and it's something that I didn't like at first, but it totally grew on me. You can nest this is saying A gets that color and A:hover gets that color, and you can organize things, you can nest them. It's fantastic. So I was just getting really frustrated with this. I was like, why why don't I just compile stylus? I mean, I wrote this tool to do this. So I pulled stylus in, and then I pulled the watch plugin in, which just watches the file system for changes. And when it sees changes, it runs arbitrary tasks that you've predefined. And you can also tell it to use, has anyone heard of live reload here? Live reload, it actually runs on a port, a custom port on the same machine. And if you put a JavaScript file in your HTML file that points to that particular script file, they have a snippet to do it. They like use sockets to communicate, and when like you do something on the back end, you can actually send a message to the client to say, hey, reload yourself. And if it's CSS, it might be smart enough to say, you don't even have to reload the whole app, just pull in a new style sheet, because when you just swap in a style sheet, the browser just automatically renders it. You don't have to restart the page. So like, if we look here, this is a basic grunt file, right? I'm initializing the config. It's very declarative in nature. You can get kind of programmy, but like, it looks like JSON for a reason. I wanted to make it a set of rules instead of lots of programming, especially for people who are newer. Plus, it just felt easier to me. So here, you have a task, and then you have some number of targets inside of that. And so a target is kind of a subset of specific rules. So you could have multiple targets with different options under a specific task. I just have one stylus. When I want to compile my slides, I'm going to take that source stylus file and compile it into that destination CSS file. There's tons of options I could specify, lots of things you can do there, super basic. And if I just type grunt, so you can see grunt dash help, you can see that I've got stylus and watch configured there, and then a default task, which if I just run grunt by itself, it'll just run everything that I've specified. So if I say grunt stylus, it's just going to compile my stylus. If the build folder doesn't exist, it's going to create it for me. These are things that like I just didn't want to have to deal with every single time. So it's got like this makedir -p like automatically creating directories for you if they don't exist, that kind of stuff, because I'm lazy. So it'll take this stylus file and it will compile it in the build folder into the CSS file, which if I turn on word wrapping, it's and what's really cool is it handles all of those. Stylus has an add-on called nib, which is like what Compass is for Sass, if that means anything to you, which basically allows you to write things that would normally have crazy vendor prefixes like animations and keyframes and all this crazy CSS stuff. You just write it once in the standard way and it expands it for you. So like text shadow. I write text shadow none here, and then when I look at the CSS file, actually, it's not doing it. Well, for other ones that it would do, it will add all the different prefixes. I think I don't have nib included. Oh no, here for background sizes, it's doing all the prefix stuff. So it handles that when I import nib. Anyways, I did this. Grunt stylus will compile that file, and I could have a whole bunch. I have grunt stylus : styles, and I could have other targets that have that compile different other files into different output files with different rules, etc. I just have one because it's a very small project. And then this watch thing, if I type grunt watch, it will watch any files for changes specified here, and you can kind of see what I'm getting at here. Stylus.slides.source is stylus.slides.source. It's kind of, instead of having to use lots of variables, you can kind of be very declarative about it. You could write this whole thing in JSON and just read it from the file system. Grunt also supports YAML if you want to use that, so you could write it in YAML and just pull it in there. You could read the YAML file, or it is JavaScript here, so I could use variables. I could create a function that returns that value, that computes it all dynamically. When any of the files specified here, this could be an array, this could actually be a wildcard, it could be a whole bunch of different things, run this task, which is what I just ran manually. So if I like throw this off to the side, and say grunt watch, and then you'll see over here, if I change my stylus file, just save it, you can see that it does the compiling on the left-hand side. And I have my terminal open, I'm doing that stuff. You'll see when I show the WebStorm thing that you don't really have, you can do it as part of your ID instead of having a terminal open. That's just the way I typically do it. So styles that is a very discrete thing that it does. And if I had more complicated things, like if I was editing separate JavaScript files, I'm just using a JavaScript library for this. I'm not writing any. I would probably have the JS hint plugin to lint. I might have my favorite unit test plugin set up. And then every time I modified a script, I would probably lint and test those JavaScript files. And then when they're all done, maybe compile them or at least tell the system to live reload to pull them in. And so live reload, these all work orthogonally. Styles live reload, they can all have overlapping sets of files, or they could, however you want. By setting the live reload option to true, this name is just coincidentally live reload. It's easier to read. You set the live reload option to true, and then when any of these files on the file system change, it doesn't run a task, but it pings the web page and says, hey, reload itself. So if I run, oh, and by the way, last thing, I'm loading the 2 plugins, and then here I'm setting my default task to run stylus, and then watch where it sits and waits. So if I just run grunt by itself, you'll see that it runs the stylus task, and then it runs watch, and it sits and waits. Now, if I open this web page up, I'm gonna make it a little smaller, so you can see, and go to my text editor, I can actually change things like, let's see. So IDE support. And so I can change this. And you'll actually, oh, I have to reload, sorry, I have to reload the page to get it going. So there it goes. You can see it's actually watching. So I make my changes on the fly, it changes them, it's using live reload to do this. It's just a little bit of setup, and you just have to make sure you have that port free, which is like 37,000 something. Only live reload uses it. I've never had a conflict. Now, I was talking about IDE support, and I was super psyched about this because the way I quit grunt in the terminal, and I've got the latest WebStorm loaded here, and if I go to Tools and open Grunt Console, which is out in the menu now, actually it scans and gives me like a list of all the tasks in the grunt file. Now, I haven't publicly expose them. So they're doing something in there, like they're hacking inside, which I know in the future we're going to publicly expose this stuff in a way that lets anyone do this. But I never thought that someone would take my little toy thing and put it in a WebStorm, right? So anyways, if I run the default task, you'll see it's actually running in here. It's running watch. Let's see. WebStorm. And then if I look for the thing, so IDE support is great. I did some CSS stuff too. I was really excited about this. Gradients, right? But this is, but like I was in here, I don't know, I found this on a website. It was super cool. So there's my shout out to Code Poet. And Leah Veru, but here I can take this and I'll just edit my my H1. You know, it can be like 5.5. It reloads it. It changes the size. It didn't restart the page. You didn't see the it didn't like refresh or anything. It just did it all through live reload like instantly. Now I mean there's a second while it does the very quick compilation from stylus to CSS and then pings the server, but it's pretty quick. So like it's pretty nice to like this is getting integrated in tools. It's very easy to use. It's just right in the tools menu there. I had nothing to do with it, but it works. So if I quit this, the grunt watch will stop, but of course that stays exactly the same. So I wanted to talk about a little bit how this actually works. How you'd use it in your project. Because I don't want you to feel like overwhelmed by wanting to use grunt. I just want to look at that gradient again. I don't want you to feel overwhelmed about using grunt in your project. There have been a number of articles written mainly for designers, which are like, hey, graphic designers, please don't be afraid of grunt. It's actually pretty simple. You just have to follow some steps. And the thing is, yeah, there are a few steps you have to follow, but once you've done that, it's actually pretty straightforward. And we have a getting started guide as well. But some people have told me that it's maybe a little too technical, so we're working on a set of screencasts as well. But there's just a few basic things that you need to know about how to actually get Grunt running in a project. Because the project that I've shown you already has a Grunt file, okay? Well, there's another file that it has as well. It has a package.json file, which is a JSON file that's used to describe to NPM the thing that comes with Node that helps you install packages. It tells it what to install. So instead of in your README saying, hey, when you clone this project, run npm install foo bar baz and have 9,000 things there, you can literally just store it in a package.json and just say run a command. The gruntfile.js, that's the grunt file, like a makefile or rakefile or whatever. It's written in JavaScript. If you save it with a .coffee extension, it'll run in CoffeeScript as well. We kind of have an older version of CoffeeScript there. Still, it works. So that's the thing that tells Grunt what to do. And then there's the Grunt CLI, which is a separate tool that you would install that, well, I'll get to that in a sec. So package.json, your JSON file is going to look something like this. Name and version aren't really important for your project unless you're actually publishing it to NPM as a module that you want other people to be able to install. But you can add those things there. It's just JSON, and you have dependencies and dev dependencies. Dependencies are the ones that your project would require if you were publishing it to NPM, and when people installed it in their project, it needed other things to work. Dev dependencies are the things that you would install in your project that would help you author your project. Grunt is not a dependency for a project, it's a dev dependency for a project. When someone takes their little library that gives you 3 extra array methods, you don't really need to have Grunt installed to be able to use that library. You might need it to be installed to be able to lint the code and run the unit tests and generate the documentation and all that kind of stuff for the library. So they qualify as dev dependencies. If you want to create this file, it's really easy. npm, which should be in your path by now since you've installed Node.js, has an init subcommand. npm init will create a package.json file in your current directory. It'll ask you for some default options. You can override them. Usually what I do is just hold down the enter key until it stops and then go in with my text editor and edit the file. It doesn't really matter. There's a tool, if anyone's heard of Yeoman, that's a kind of a scaffolding tool for JavaScript projects, which has basically subsumed the Grunt init project that I created a couple of years ago. Yeoman, you install that one, you run it. It has a whole bunch of different templates for Angular and Ember and HTML5 boilerplate, using Grunt, using Gulp, using all these other different tools. You would find the generator that you like and run Yeoman command, and it would generate the Grunt file, package.json, all those things for you. You could write it by hand. You could copy and paste, whatever. It's just a JSON file. I do like npm init because I hate hand editing JSON because of those damn trailing commas. Either way, this shows in dev dependencies for this project that Grunt and 3 Grunt contrib plugins have been specified in this project. This would be committed with the project so that anyone who grabs the project can have access to that. And then instead of telling people, do all of these commands to install all of these dependencies at all of these versions, you just tell them to type in npm install. And npm install will go through that entire list and install them all and just handle it for you. It's very convenient. So that's really why you care about package.json, is because it simplifies the ramp-up time for someone to get involved. You don't have to edit a README and stuff. You say run npm install. And if you want to add new dev dependencies, npm install -- save - dev, and then whatever your dev dependencies, Grunt, contrib, foo, whatever. If in your Grunt file, you wanted to do something that doesn't exist in a Grunt plugin, but there happens to be like a compiler module that you want to use, you would add compiler as a dev dependency in your package.json, just like they tell you to do with Node in general. If you've ever used Node, you would require that, and then you would use it just like you would in any other Node.js script. The Grunt file is just a Node.js thing that Grunt processes. So if you have any questions about using non-Grunt things in a Grunt file, you absolutely can do that. Just look at some tutorials about Node. And it will eventually have tutorials, screencasts about like doing non-grunt things in a grunt file. But it's just Node.js, JavaScript, so you can go crazy in there. The grunt file, here's a sample grunt file. It's always going to be module.exports equals a function that receives grunt as an argument. Basically, when grunt reads this grunt file, it's going to take that function, run it, and pass itself into the function so that you can do things with the currently running grunt. You can initialize the config. There's a lot of methods. You can like specifically set a property. You can get properties out of the config. You can initialize it all at once with a big object. And then you would basically, the config object is just an object. It's just basically like a JavaScript map or a dict or a hash or whatever. It's got properties and they have values. They could be sub-objects, et cetera. And you're going to, there's some built-in grunt stuff, different ways to handle templates. Like you can kind of see package.name. There's a package property, grunt file.readJSON. Basically what this grunt file does is it reads that JSON file, converts it into an object, and stores that entire object as the package property, the config, that you can actually then use anywhere you want. So you can really determine where you want to store the metadata, but I don't have to store the name of the project or the version of the project in multiple places. I can store it in one source of truth and then read that into the grunt file at runtime, and it will just do whatever it needs to with that. So it just reduces redundancy. Here, this is how I tell Grunt to actually care about a plugin that I've installed. If I don't do this, Grunt doesn't see it. And the reason for that is because if Grunt had to go searching every time, it would be very slow. There are NPM modules that people have written to scan through package.json and just require everything that starts with grunt, like every grunt plugin. So people have written abstractions around that. And here, I'm registering a task. This is the default task. This means when I run grunt without any other parameters, it runs the uglify task. It's an array, so it can be a lot of things. I can register any number of alias tasks that I want, give them a name, give them a list of, and it could be like uglify : foo : bar, like I could pass any parameters into that string. I can also register a task, and instead of passing it an array of other tasks to run, it could be a function. And that function is just JavaScript that runs. By default, asynchronous, but you can set a flag to say, hey, this is going to run asynchronously, so wait until it's done to continue on with the next task. There's a few different ways we can run tasks in Grunt. So this package.json is for NPM, install stuff. Grunt file is for Grunt. It's where you actually put the meat of your build stuff. And then the Grunt CLI is the last thing. NPM and Node have this way of organizing themselves. And I think it's really smart, but it's confusing to a lot of people. When you install a package with NPM, like let's just say Grunt. In my project, say I've got foo and bar. Those are my two projects. If I install Grunt version 044 in there, well, let's just say I installed it globally. Let's say I put Grunt in the path. So I install Grunt 044 into the path. And now anywhere, if I type Grunt, I'll get Grunt 044. And so let's say I've got another project that someone else was working on that I need to go make some changes to. So I pull that project down, and their project requires Grunt 034, like a previous, completely different version of Grunt that has different behaviors. So now I've got Grunt 044 on my path, but this one project requires a different version. So what do? Do I uninstall the global one and then install a new one? It doesn't scale very well, and people have written entire programs around managing virtual environments for language interpreters like Ruby or Python or Node to do that, because you want it in your path, but you want to be able to switch the version at any time based on the project. Well, this is kind of a non-trivial thing, and it's a huge pain. And actually, Node doesn't recommend that you do that. They say don't install things globally. Install things locally in your project. When you do an npm install foo, it creates a Node module subfolder with foo inside of it. So if I look in here, when I did an npm install, it created a Node modules folder that contained the 3 plugins that I happen to be using. If I look at my package.json, we can see that I've just got this stuff. And look, there's a whole bunch of stuff that I forgot to remove from the npm init that I just held down the enter key on. It installs these 3 Grunt plugins into this Node modules folder. When you type npm install, npm install Grunt will go into the Node modules folder. But there's like an executable in there, but it's not like in your path. You'd have to do like this kind of crazy workaround to get to it. The solution around all of this, you want to install your things locally to your project. So this project can have Grunt 04, and this project can have Grunt 03, and this project can have Grunt 02 or whatever. You want to install all those into the project locally in your node modules folder, as is the idiomatic Node.js way. But we've developed a separate tool. It's really dumb. You install it globally, -G, it puts it in the path. All this tool does is it prevents you from having to type ./node/module/.bin/grunt or npm grunt or any of those things every time. All it does when you run grunt via the command line is it looks where you are in the directory structure, finds the local one in that node modules folder, and just runs it. It's very dumb. It's very simple. It does a few basic things like that. So it's kind of like a very lightweight wrapper around the grunt that you have installed in your project. I'm seeing more people do this. So it seems like maybe this is a good approach. I'm not sure. The guys who maintain NPM and Node haven't told me you're doing it wrong, and they would. And they have, definitely, for certain things. And Grunt has evolved wonderfully over the last 2 years because of good feedback like that. But for this, I think they're saying that this is kind of, they haven't really said this is how you should do it, but it works. You install the npm install -g grunt CLI once per machine. Once it's in your path, then you can always have grunt in your path. And if you're in a folder and you don't actually have grunt installed locally in node modules, you'll get this error, fatal error, unable to find local grunt. And I put a paragraph here explaining why, but people still get really confused. Here, if I run grunt, there is a grunt in that node modules folder, so it just runs grunt. So that's it. You just do that one thing up front. That's the one weird thing that trips people up, and they're like, why can't I install grunt globally? Well, because I'm not going to write a virtual environment manager for grunt so that you can have 900 versions installed globally. It's just, I can't do it. Those are the three basic things that you would need to do to get started with grunt. You'd probably do this first. Just do it up front. Get it installed. I guess you probably need to install Node first, so that's like a zeroth thing. Sorry. And then for each project, create a package.json, create a grunt file. And then in the package.json, you just define your dependencies. As you go, just npm install --save-dev. When you install a new one, it just gets put in there. It gets installed and put in there automatically. And then just edit your grunt file. And that's getting started with grunt. It's actually really simple. Now, there's a ton of tutorials. Grunt's been out for about 2 years. I was coerced into releasing it the first time because it was not ready, and of course nothing I write is ever ready. So it was kind of cool because people got into it. Apparently it was scratching an itch that a lot of people had but didn't realize. Because if they had realized, there would be 73 grunts by the time I created it, and I wouldn't have created it. So I created this. I got a lot of great feedback from people. And it's changed a lot, where we have a future version coming up, which we're calling grunt-next for now, because we're not exactly sure how we're going to roll it out version-wise. But we're basically rewriting it to be easier to maintain, because this is a little bit monolithic right now. We're breaking things out piece by piece, like the logging, the file system, the globbing stuff, all the util stuff. Those are all being broken out into separate libs. But the tool itself, there's lots of tutorials out there that explain more the next steps after this. And for what it's worth, a lot of people are using this tool right now. There's a few other ones. There's Gulp, which is really cool, which is another thing, but it's heavily based on streams. So we're looking at working with those guys to do something cool. Grunt itself, it has that really declarative kind of style of writing it, and I think some general simplicity, and a lot of plugins for it. You can find a lot of projects on GitHub using Grunt to build. For example, jQuery, if I go to their Grunt file, it's kind of cool. They use Git submodules, and they have their Grunt file set up that if you haven't done a git init submodules yet, it'll actually do that for you first. They've got a lot of logic in their grunt file. So they're linting stuff, they're building stuff, and you can do like conditional builds, you can do crazy stuff with jQuery. They're linting a lot of files. And then what they actually do is, it's hard to see because my theme here, but they actually look at the size of jQuery in the minified version, the raw and gzipped, and they actually test it, this run to the last run, to see if it got smaller or bigger, because when my buddy Rick Waldron, who does a lot of work on jQuery, is editing the code, he does not want any change he makes to make it bigger in any way, because then people complain if jQuery gets bigger, because it's whatever, all this, it's because it's used on 30 bazillion sites and people have the crazy expectations. So they actually have this report at the end of every run of Grunt. It tells you how much bigger the file got gzipped or smaller or whatever. And they actually keep a temporary file that keeps that data in there so they can do that. If you look at their Grunt file, it's got tons of custom stuff. But they use Grunt to build jQuery. There was a cool one I was looking at. Who's heard of AngularJS, the framework? Okay. This talk that I'm doing right now is like in the frameworks section of the conference. I guess it fits in. So let's talk about a framework for a second, because I don't know. So they have a lot of Grunt stuff going on. Oh my God, it's so crazy. So they have a lot of tasks. But this one I thought was like super cool. Their test, I'm just gonna let this run for a minute. It's gonna lint a bunch of files, it's gonna run a lot of tests. They're doing some really cool stuff with it's like WebDriver, or it's something like WebDriver, which basically will spin up a browser and then run the tests in that browser, and it'll communicate through some kind of like RPC mechanism between the Grunt plugin and the browser, so it can like run the unit tests in an actual browser but report them back to Grunt to see if it passes or fails. And then they've actually got Selenium running in here too, which will run all of the kind of the functional integration kind of tests. So you'll see like forms pop up on the screen, and you'll see them be magically interacted with as it goes. So it's starting Chrome on that, and Chrome is around here somewhere. So Chrome's actually running, and you can see it's just going through tons of unit tests. So it's starting Karma, and I just thought this was fascinating because apparently you can do anything in Grunt. I don't know. Grunt, when you think about it, if you know what it is, it's really just a set of conventions, mainly around defining tasks and configuring tasks. And a lot of people have written plugins for that. Grunt, it doesn't have any pipelining support. We use temp files, so that's one of the things we're working on. That's one of the things that Gulp people are thrilled about, because Gulp uses streams, and everything from the output of this one goes into the input of that one with no temp files. But of course, when you don't use temp files, you have no ability to continue your compilation from halfway through. You'd have to always start over at the beginning every time. So there are pros and cons. This is crazy. I love this. There's pros and cons of different systems, but Grunt, it's really intended to be a lightweight wrapper around these libs that are already created, that are being maintained by really smart people very proactively, you use them consistently, you configure them consistently, and generally the visual output should be relatively consistent. And we're working on making that even better in future versions. Yeah, so as you can see, it's running about 1 billion tests. But it's, yeah, fascinating. So let's see. Those are my examples. So that's pretty much all the time I have, which, I mean, that was great. Okay, maybe I went over, I don't know. But anyways, lunch is happening shortly. So there's a getting started guide. I've put this up on GitHub. I'll probably make some tweaks to it, but if you go to github.com/cowboy/ it's like Philly ETE talk or something like that. It's the most recent thing there, and I only have a few talks repositories. You can find us on Twitter, GruntJS. Even though we're Grunt, we're not GruntJS. Those were already taken. So we have a Freenode IRC channel. Grunt.js, come in there. There's a lot of people talking if you have questions. There's also a Stack Overflow group that we don't really get into a lot, but a lot of people help there. And you can talk to me afterwards. I'll be around for a bit. I've got stickers too. I've got Grunt stickers and Bocoup stickers. So thank you very much for having me here at Philly ET. I really appreciate it. Thank you all.